Rick Dunham, founder and chairman of Dunham Company. Rick is the former chair of the Giving USA Foundation. He is a nationally respected and leading voice in charitable giving and has been widely published in journals such as The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Please welcome Rick Dunham.
Good afternoon, post-lunch. Really good to be with you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. So real quickly, by way of background as well, I want to give you a brief kind of how I got into this business. So back in the late 70s, I was pursuing my degree, my Master's of Theology at Dallas Seminary, and worked with the president and got into donor care, which I didn't know anything about. And it began to put in my heart something that I didn't know was there. And it was a passion to help ministries exceed and even fulfill and even exceed the call that God had placed on them by building the funding that they needed. Post-graduation, ended up 11 years working in ministries, and for 4 years was 5 years VP of Advancement at Biola University. And then in '89 went into consulting, and in 2002 started Dunham Company. We have a thing called the Dunham Way, and if you look at number one, our measurement of success is we're all about kingdom impact. And our vision and our passion is to work with ministries and local churches and helping them in their marketing, fundraising, communications, and media to fulfill the call that God has placed on their ministry. And right now we're working with well over 100 organizations and churches. We have an office in Australia, which is really pretty fun, 15 years of working there. And in my career, I would say about 15 years into my career, I was working with a ministry, and the head of the ministry got this letter from a donor that basically said, God will provide without you doing the fundraising. And now, being in the pastorate, you know the pushback you get from time to time when you'll talk about money or giving. And I took this one as seriously. I go, okay, let me think about this for a moment. If this donor is true, the question in my mind is what I've dedicated my life to, does it bring a smile to the face of God? Or is it something that actually he detests? So it began a journey on my part, and what we're going to talk about today is why teaching on giving is so essential. And what I want to do is I want to be able to illustrate it in three ways. I want to talk, first of all, you can't really understand this thing about giving until you really understand the biblical perspective on money and its power. Secondly, what does biblical giving really look like? I want to look at a couple of illustrations of that. And then finally, this whole issue of asking for money. So the first thing is to understand that money is one thing that controls all of our lives. If you think about it, and if you're honest with yourself, especially in an economy like this, money is a very powerful force that controls our life. Whether you're uber rich or very poor, money has this extraordinary power over our hearts. And it can control our lives. We saw that in the GFC when there was an implosion financially. We're seeing it now with the economy and how that controls our lives. In fact, it's so controlling that Jesus spoke about money more than heaven and hell combined. It's that important. In fact, what Jesus said is that our relationship to money is at the core of our relationship with God. Now, you may disagree with me on this, so let me talk a little bit about this. We put money typically in the kind of the side category over here. But actually, Jesus puts it front and center. And the reason he does is because money has the ability of pulling our heart away from God. Jesus said in Matthew 6 this way, wherever we invest our resources determines what gains our heart. And it's either going to be God or money. So Jesus himself made this binary choice. He said, wherever we put our treasure, that determines what gains our heart. And either it's going to be God or it's going to be money. And it's one of the reasons why I believe that money is one of Satan's key lines of attack. Because he knows that if he can get us to trust our stuff more than God, he wins. Because he's neutered us spiritually. And we're going to see an illustration of this in just a moment. In 1 Timothy, Paul's protege Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, he says it this way. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Let's pause there for a moment. Just think about the statement. The love, Jesus said this issue of money and our relationship with it has to do with our heart. And what Paul's telling Timothy is for the love of money, heart issue, it's a root of all sorts of wickedness, of evil. And then he gives an illustration. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So you've got people who say they're Christ followers, eager for money, have now wandered from their faith, and their life is falling apart. That's the power of money. In fact, when you think about the power of money, I want to go to Matthew chapter 26, because this really captures it all. So Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if you deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. The power of money was what finally pushed Judas over the edge to betray Christ. So money, first point I want to make is that money is an extremely powerful force that can move our heart away from God, and Satan knows that. So what's the antidote? Well, the antidote is giving. Because giving demonstrates that money does not have mastery over my heart. So let's talk a little bit about giving. Most Christians think of the tithe. Challenge is, according to the Indiana University School of Philanthropy panel study, the average Christian household gives 2.8% of disposable income. So that's not even a good tip. Not even close to 10%. Fortunately, the New Testament does not parse giving percentages. Paul, when he's talking to the Corinthian church about fulfilling their pledge, says this, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart. And there it is again. Decided in your heart what to give. And he also tells Timothy that when he's working with wealthy people, tell him to be generous and willing to share. And generosity, of course, is an issue of the heart. And we're going to see, again, an illustration of this in just a second. But in this whole area of giving, there's two examples of the control and the power of money and the role of giving or the lack of it that are just, to me, astounding. As I did my study in Scripture, these two illustrations. The first is the church of Laodicea, Revelation chapter 3. And we know the story very well. Pastor Rick talked about it this morning. 7 churches in Revelation. Laodicea is the last one. And so what's problem does Jesus have with the church of Laodicea? Well, this is what he says in Revelation chapter 3. I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were cold or hot. So because you were lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. Anybody that spent time in that passage knows that the verb for spit is to vomit. And this is a pretty rugged condemnation that Jesus is making of this church. Because he's basically saying, your spiritual lukewarmness makes me sick to my stomach. And in fact, it makes me want to throw up. And you might think, wow, okay, what could cause that? Like not showing up at church enough, not doing Bible study, not praying, maybe not doing mission work, not what's the issue? Why is it that Jesus would say that? And he says this, because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing. And I want to park it here for a minute because this is super important. The way the Greek is constructed here is really interesting. Notice what Jesus says, because you say, these are the words you use to describe yourself. One, I am rich. And the construction there says, this is my identity. This is the way I see myself. I am rich. So what do you say about yourself? I'm a Christ follower? I'm rich. Second thing, and have become wealthy, perfect tense. Notice the progression. I have become wealthy. I didn't inherit it. I have become. And it's a perfect tense, meaning past action, ongoing results. In their mind, they're thinking, I'm rich, I have become wealthy, and that's going to last in perpetuity. Therefore, I don't need anything. Implication, not even you, Jesus, I'm good. So what does Jesus go on to say? And you do not know, you think this is the way you are, but you do not know that you are actually wretched and miserable. You think you're really happy, but nah. Spiritually, you're miserable. You're poor. You're not wealthy. You're blind. You cannot see. And you're naked. You're not clothed in richness. And if you recall this passage, Jesus goes on to say, buy from me gold refined by fire. Put on white linen. His implication, take what I've entrusted to you and invest it in the stuff of righteousness. And then he says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Issue, your identity has become your wealth, your richness, your money. It's stolen your heart, and it's stolen my relationship with you. And it's created a spiritual apathy that makes me want to throw up because I desperately want that fellowship with you. You've got to change. That's his point. That's the power of money. To woo the heart away, to do what Paul talked to Timothy about, is that the love of money, it's so powerful that it can steal your heart away from God himself. Does it mean you lose your salvation? No. But the fellowship, the tenderness, the commitment, the wholly devoted heart is impossible. By contrast, you have the churches of Macedonia, and you're familiar with this. So you'll recall that Paul on his missionary journeys had taken up pledges and a collection for the saints in Jerusalem who were suffering. And so these churches made commitments, they were collecting them along the way. Well, the Corinthian church, which happened to be quite wealthy, crossroads of trade, had failed to fulfill their commitment, their pledge. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul uses the churches of Macedonia to shame them a little bit, unfortunately, but that's what he does, a little bit for not fulfilling their commitment. This is what he says. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. So again, let's park it here for a moment. Paul's doing here is making some contrasts. Here's a group of churches who are being severely persecuted, yet there's overflowing joy. Here's a group of churches who are not just poor, but in extreme poverty. I can't help but think of what Pastor Rick was talking about, the widow's mite this morning. My mind immediately went to these churches. Extremely poor. What contrast that? Welled up in rich generosity. They gave beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. They're leaning in heavily. They're pleading for this opportunity to give. Notice a little bit of difference between them and the Laodiceans. Their money didn't own them. They gave what they could, far beyond, Paul says, what they expected. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then by the will of God also to us. Again, a matter of the heart. Completely, wholly devoted commitment. Laodicea, their wealth is their identity, with a heart that had shut God out. Macedonians, extremely poor, giving everything they can and beyond. And what does he say about them? They gave themselves first. They're wholly devoted to God. They're sold out, completely sold out. And I would argue that money was a thing that kept the Laodiceans from being sold out to Jesus. And that's why he was so upset. Which then takes us to the fun topic of asking. So, I know, again, we all get pushback from people when we ask for money and we challenge people. So the question is asking, challenging God's people, a necessary evil to fund ministry? Because I know a lot of people feel that way. You might not verbalize it that way, but you feel like, sometimes it doesn't feel too good. I'm going to give you a definition, and then I want to support it through Scripture, that I believe challenging God's people to give is the spiritual discipline God has established to help move the hearts of his people to become wholly his. And I want to circle back around to what Jesus said at the very beginning in Matthew chapter 6. Wherever you put your treasure, store up your treasure in heaven, where moth and rust cannot destroy. Why? Because wherever you put your treasure, that's where your heart's going to be. And I believe that this is why challenging people to give, knowing the power of money to woo our heart away from being wholly devoted to God. It's a spiritual discipline that God has established, because without that, ultimately, God cannot have our whole heart. So, let's look at a biblical model. You remember in Exodus chapter, I'm going to pick it up in chapter 24, but when the nation of Israel got to Mount Sinai and Moses went up on the mountain, got the commandments, came back down, God called him back up for a second time. And that's where we pick the story up in Exodus chapter 24. The eyes of the sons of Israel. To the eyes of the sons of Israel, the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So we get this picture of Moses going back up. What's interesting, if you flip the page to chapter 25, verse 1, because God was about to give him the stone tablets with the Ten Commandments written on it, the very first thing that God uttered to Moses was this, and it's chapter 25, verse 1. Move that forward. Can we advance that? Thank you. So the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering from me from everyone whose heart prompts them to give." Moses, I need you to ask the Israelites to give. Now think about this for a moment, because I think what God doesn't say here is actually even more instructive than what he says. What he didn't say was, Moses, I own a cattle on 1,000 hills. It's all mine. I want that tabernacle built for my glory. So guess what? I'm putting it all together for you. So when you get off this mountain, you gather the nation of Israel together and you build me that tabernacle. God could have done that. Or he could have said, Moses, got it covered for you. I've whispered into the hearts of my people, Israel, to give you everything you need for my tabernacle. And when you get down, just gather it all together and get it built for me, okay? He doesn't. What he tells Moses is, and the verb there is actually command the Israelites to bring me an offering. Moses, I want you to stand up in front of the Israelites and tell them to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering from everyone whose heart prompts him to give. So, we know the story. This is a very interesting passage, because I think God will demonstrate he clearly knows what he's doing in this moment. He's setting Moses up for a responsibility And the responsibility is to challenge God's people to give, because our natural inclination is not to give our stuff away. It just is not. The Laodiceans showed that. They played into the natural inclination to hold on to it and to hoard. So he sets Moses up to say, okay, I need you to do this function as a leader of the nation of Israel. Challenge them. And as God was giving that command, what was the nation of Israel doing? They were worshiping the golden calf. Okay, so we go to Exodus 32. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him, made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Do you happen to recall in Exodus 20:23 what God commanded Moses and the nation of Israel? You are not to make a god of silver or gold. He commanded that very clearly. This was apostasy on the part of the nation of Israel. But what I really want you to think about is, what were they truly worshiping? Their stuff. That golden calf was made of their own wealth. They were literally bowing down to their own material wealth. God knew this was going to happen, which is why he set up Moses earlier to say, guess what? You're going to have to challenge the nation of Israel to actually give to my tabernacle, to where my presence will dwell. So we fast forward. I'll skip over the story of how God relented in his destruction of the nation for their apostasy. We'll get to chapter 35 real quickly. So Moses said to the whole Israelite community, "This is what the Lord has commanded. From what you have, take an offering for the Lord. Everyone who is willing to bring to the Lord an offering of gold, silver, and bronze." If you know the chapter, it goes on, lists a gazillion things. Then later in the chapter, it says, "Then the whole Israelite community withdrew from Moses' presence, and everyone who was willing," and here it is again, "and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to the Lord for the work of the tent of meeting." Go back to God's command. You were to challenge them to give for everyone whose heart prompts them to give. Here, that's exactly what happened. He challenged them to give, and everyone whose heart prompted them to give gave to the Lord for the work on the tent of meeting. The outcome? I love this. Chapter 36, verses 6 and 7. "Then Moses gave an order, and they sent this word throughout the camp. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary." Now catch these words. "So the people were restrained from bringing more, because what they already had was more than enough to do all the work." God used Moses to unleash generosity in the nation of Israel to build his tabernacle. And if you read the rest of Exodus, you see them fully committed, wholly committed to God's kingdom purpose in that moment, building out his presence. And what does he do at the end of Exodus? God himself comes and dwells within that tent. That's exactly what he wanted. His purpose was fulfilled. But they didn't get there without Moses standing up in front of his people and challenging them to give. So if I have anything that I would want you to take away from today, it's a couple of things. Number one, don't underestimate the power of money to turn the heart of your people away from God. You do that at your own peril in your ministry. You really do. It is a very powerful force that it can easily move any of our hearts away from God. The second thing would be, before God, ask him to put into your heart the vision for how you can unleash generosity in your church. And I would propose that and I'm trying to encourage you here and give you a biblical basis for this, that standing up in front of challenging your people to give is one of the best things you can do to help move their heart to God. Because if what Jesus said is true, and I tend to believe what he says is true, that where their treasure is, that is where their heart is going to be. So this whole thing of giving, and I've thought about this, and I love the title of this conference, Give Conference. When you and I give, we express the very nature of God himself. For God so loved the world that he gave. Matthew 20, when the disciples are trying to get the power move on, what does Jesus say? I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to give. And I think our role in leadership is to help people understand how giving is at its very core, an expression of who God is. And as we challenge them to give, to see that generosity unleashed so God's kingdom purpose is truly fulfilled. Thank you.